So, but it was something for the kids to do around here. Back in the late '60s, there wasn't a lot to do, and so it was at least a place to go on a Saturday night. I myself, I think the ones that I came to were literally 40 years ago this very time, and I happened to have my camera with me, and I'd driven my bike over from Exeter because I was living in Exeter at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And went to their concert here back in December of 1972. But we were just mostly sitting, in the chairs around the perimeter of the room and just talking. That's what I remember anyways. I don't remember, maybe they danced later on, but I doubt it very much. I mean, that wasn't music you could really dance to, as I recall, so. But, it was one of those things where they were not perceived as talented, by us other kids. Kids will be kids, but as you get older and you know who they are, and as they turned out, they were really fine kids. It's just they just didn't have the singing ability at the time,
They did the best they could.
Kids can be, right?
Yeah.
But. No.
So were the kids like make fun of them, or?
Well, they would make comments.
Just kind of
you gotta
ignore
remember, and this is not a reflection on the town. This is anywhere. I mean, I went to St. Michael's, a Catholic school, and got picked on all the time.
Sure.
But they were not well educated.
Mm-hmm.
Their father didn't let them really get well educated.
They were homeschooled.
They were, yeah.
Except for Rachel.
And the two boys were, I don't think he didn't love them as much as he cared for the girls. So one boy was Austin. He's just not a very bright kid. He's my age too. And Robert, who was younger, was more like the bullier type.
Right.
That's how he would lash out.
Right.
But I knew them a little bit better than I did the girls because they were in Boy Scouts.
Right.
But because they weren't well educated and they were from very, very humble circumstances.
Yeah.
Kids will be kids and would pick on them.
Sure.
Or make comments.
And plus, it's not like they saw him at school and ever got to know him, so
Right.
they were like
outsiders. So they were picked on, for what they were. Like I was picked on because I liked to write history. Right. So I must have been
a geek.
Gay guy.
Or a geek. Or
gay,
something.
yeah, gay geek
Okay.
or whatever, And I mean, this is how, kids are, So it's just, everybody has their crap that they got to deal with in this life, of course.
Yeah.
So it was that sort of a circumstances. And then, of course, the girls they're older than me, I think Rachel is maybe a year or two older than me. And she was the youngest daughter, as I recall.
Right.
So I didn't know them as well.
Right.
And the only time I actually remember seeing them was when they'd come in here, when this was the town library.
Oh, this was the town library.
Yeah, this was the library until 2002.
Wow.
And I and two other library trustees got the new library built down the street. So I can remember when they'd come in to look at books or something.
Yeah.
Because I was still too young to be left home alone because my mother was the librarian. So, and we had bookcases where these are now.
Display cases.
Right. And so that's the only time I ever really saw them, but they weren't like overly talkative or sociable back then, so I didn't really get to know them.
Right.
But I was the type of person that because my parents took in a lot of foster children, in fact I was one of them, only they ended up adopting me.
Okay.
You learn to be more compassionate or understanding.
Right.
Because
Not
you
so
saw
quick to
all
judge.
kinds of exactly.
Right.
You saw all kinds of different situations.
Right.
And you knew that it wasn't always that kid's fault, it was the crappy parents they had.
Right.
Right. So I learned to be much more understanding and tolerant.
Yeah.
But I do remember some of the kids, would make fun of, like we'd call Austin Austin the Frostin' for some reason,
Austin the Frost.
Yeah,
Wow.
That's about as mean as it got for you. So,
That's,
but
not so, that's not so bad.
No,
Could
not
be
at
a lot
all.
worse.
Yeah, but it just goes, they were, it was a small town.
Yeah,
And,
sure. Sure.
Actually, this town was extremely close knit. A lot of us were all related in many ways. We had 3 or 4 good-sized families that even my own sister married into the Bulldog family, and sometimes this will be called Bulldogville because there were so many Bulldogs. But there were Burleys and Copps and Turners and Emrys, and so it was a very, almost everybody was related one way or the other. It was a close-knit community.
So, a little bit about the town,
Mm-hmm.
about the history of the town, if you get it.
Well, just that it dates back, it was originally a part of Exeter,
Right.
which dates back to 1638. Then when Brentwood separated in 1742, we became part of Brentwood, and then we separated from Brentwood in 1764.
Okay.
We were a town that was literally pretty much off the beaten path,
Mm-hmm.
and that became even more so when they built the highway system, because 125 and 101, which are the 2 major highways around here, and 102, just barely missed Fremont.
Okay.
So all we have is 107,
So no real sort of manufacturing that was around here later?
well, we had the barrel cooperage that came in 1874 and closed in 1999.
Okay.
That employed, when it burned in December 6th of 1973, it put 100 people out of work.
Wow.
That was the equivalent of what happened in Newtown, Connecticut yesterday to this town, just before Christmas and all of that. And then when they did rebuild in 74, it only employed about 35 or 40 people. And then I worked for the cooperage the
You did?
last 2 years that it was opened.
Oh, okay.
I was their events coordinator and would put together
So what was the
festivals and
cooperage
things.
making the last 2 years? Still making reels?
barrels, but mostly like those popcorn buckets
Okay.
and other wooden novelty items
Uh-huh.
that they would sell to Walmart or Kmart and Macy's and all of that.
Right.
It was really a fascinating business. It really was.
Yeah, I bet.
But we never had a lot of industry in this town. We did have a brickyard on the north side of town from 1885 until about 1900, and that employed another 100 brickmakers. But other than that, it's just been a real bedroom community
Gotcha.
with small little, businesses like an occasional restaurant or two and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But this town was in many ways bypassed by progress, which in our way is what makes us so quaint now.
Right.
But now it's a town with 4,300 people versus only 800 when, not even 1,000 when they were playing in
Really?
this town. Back
So
in the-
under 1,000 when they were doing the dances.
Right. Fremont never hit 1,000 population until 1971,
Okay.
and then even in 1980 we only had 1,333 people.
Okay.
So
Now what was the riots? I see
the riots are.
what happened there?
That was, we've had 4 riots in this town. The Mass Tree Riot was where it was against the law to cut down white pine trees that measured 24 inches in diameter, 2 feet above the ground. Because the King's Royal Navy reserved those pine trees to be used as mass.
Sure.
So even if you had them growing on your land, you weren't supposed to cut them down. Well, of course, that didn't stop you from cutting them down.
Right.
Well, what happened was each northern province colony had a surveyor of the King's Woods,
Uh-huh.
and his job was to apprehend people who were illegally cutting down those pine trees. Well, he was coming to what was actually Copyhole Mill, which was just over the Fremont line in Brentwood,
Mhm.
because he had heard that they were illegally cutting those trees there. Well, when he got to the mill, he was threatened with his life that he better turn around and leave or he would be killed. So now he's thoroughly convinced that there were illegal lumber there.
Wow.
So he goes back to Portsmouth, which was then the provincial capital of New Hampshire in 1734, and he brings a committee of 10 guys with him. Well, they put up for the night because they were able to row a boat or something from Portsmouth down this Squamscott to downtown Exeter. Well, they put up for the night at an inn in downtown Exeter, and they got to drinking and carousing, and word got out what their intent was. So now about 40 guys around Exeter dress up as so-called Natick Indians and attacked them and roughed them up and punched holes in their boats and sent them back to Portsmouth. So it was kind of like a two-part riot. And that's the first mass tree riot in American history, which technically what they were doing is they were rebelling against the king's unreasonable laws.
Sure.
Kind of like that was one of
They
many
wanted to have
factors that
determination on whether they could cut down their trees or not.
right,
Yeah.
right, and that was one of the one of several factors that led to the American Revolution, and
And ironically, I mean, now everybody's trying to protect old growth trees.
right,
It's kind
Exactly.
of ironic considering what's happened now.
Precisely,
Yeah.
exactly. And then we had a Civil War riot in July 4th of 1861 when they were trying to recruit some boys to sign up to go into the Civil War. Well, they were raising a 150-foot high Liberty pole at the intersection of Sandown Road and 107 in the village there. There's right next to that store that's down there. And someone attempted to shoot at the American flag. Well, now this riot breaks out.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't a big riot, but it was a little riot. And
Big for Fremont.
that's right, and our brave boys in blue squelched them, and if there's to be a war, let it begin here, as anywhere else, is what they were quoted as saying.
Wow.
So that happened to be, it tied for the fourth Civil War riot in American history.
Okay.
And it was the first in New England.
Okay.
So
Wow.
that same day, ironically,
Had nothing to do with slavery, though.
no, not at that time. It was just, well, you got to remember.
Well, slavery wouldn't be an issue up here anyway, right? Or,
Well, but it really became an issue, and you have to remember it was the northern abolitionists that
Yeah.
were instigating the abolition of slavery.
Sure.
And so, of course, the people like Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, who were our presidents, they thought they were a bunch of radicals, trying to stir up all this trouble and get the country into a war, which it eventually did. But
Right.
but at that time, it was, you got to remember, most people never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace.
Yeah.
So the South might as well have been Europe to them. So let them go, and you had relatives down there. You didn't want to go to war in all cases. So
Plus, you had slaves coming up here via the Underground Railroad.
that's right. That's
I mean,
right.
would
But
they
they were
stop
going to
here?
Canada.
They would keep going. They
Right,
wouldn't
because
stop here for any
if they stayed here,
particular reason.
the Fugitive Act of 1850
They
meant
could be
that
apprehended.
and
Right.
brought back down south.
Right. Right.
That was 1857 when Taney issued that.
Right.
That really spearheaded things going to eventually abolish slavery.
Right.
But that was actually kind of an afterthought by
Right.
Lincoln.
Right.
It just got to the point, we need to abolish this issue and get this done.
Taney
with.
was the Supreme Court justice.
That's right. Yeah. And he
He also did Dred Scott, right?
Dred Scott decision. That's right. Which was, I think, where he could be apprehended in the North and returned to his.
Right.
I may be confusing that with the Dred Scott case. That's right. That was 1857, and the Fugitive
Fugitive Act
Act
was
was
something
1850
else.
or something like that.
Yeah. Right.
But anyways, that's why that happened.
Mhm.
And then we had some Irishmen who were building the railroad here in 1874, and they went up to Raymond because you couldn't buy liquor here, and they got drinking and carousing on St. Patrick's Day, and on their way back, they attacked some houses and some people.
Mhm.
And they got into Fremont Village, and they were creating quite a stir, and some of our townspeople squelched that and got them arrested, and they had to go to court.
This is the third one.
That was the fourth and last one.
Fourth and last.
The second one was when the British came to town to arrest a deserter from the French and Indian War in 1757.
Okay.
and
there
the
was a
townspeople
riot?
weren't going to let them.
Okay. They
Yeah.
stood up for him.
And they feared for their lives. They literally chased them out of town and down through Kingston, and
Wow.
they literally feared for their lives. So the townspeople were in no mood to let them, the British, take this guy away, evidently.
That's great.
So kind of a neat, for a little town that.
Spunky.
Right, it was spunky, exactly.
I mean, you have to have some courage to go up against the British Army.
You really did,
Yeah.
especially in that time, because
Yeah.
back in the 1750s, I mean.
They were badasses,
Yeah.
as we've seen.
Yeah, well, you had to be to survive. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't even want to even think about going back even 100 years to live with now, knowing what we know, what we've had to, what
Yeah.
life is like for us now.
Yeah.
We would not want to even go back even 100 years.
Right.
The disease and the illnesses and the
Lifespan.
poverty and the struggles that people went through. Even when I was a kid, I remember shacks in this town. People lived in literally one-room shacks.
Yeah.
And not only in Fremont, but in Brentwood and a lot of these small towns. We don't even,
So there's not poverty like that anymore?
well, there's
I mean,
a little
it's
of it,
changed.
but
They've-
mostly it's
They've
in Epping.
relocated.
Right. It's mostly
It's
now
probably
in
just moved
Epping
around.
and smaller towns.
Right.
This is this is southern New Hampshire. So a lot of Massachusetts, Connecticut people have moved here and they brought their money and they got all these nice homes now.
Okay, so this is
So this
kind
is
of a wealthy area?
actually kind of
Kind of affluent?
a kind of affluent area, even though Fremont is still probably the poorest town that borders us.
Okay.
But the difference with Fremont is the people who live here, even though they're not as well-to-do as some of the other towns around us, they've still got the vast majority of Fremonters still take pride in their property and keep things up, and they pay their bills as best they can. You don't have. I can take you to places in West Epping that you'd swear you were still in the hills of Appalachia.
Oh,
Seriously.
really?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
And even that's changing now that Epping's got all this, all the shopping centers now that have, like they just opened up a 12-screen movie theater here a month ago.
Right.
And Epping is really kind of an up-and-coming town now.
Right.
But so now it's getting so that a lot of those poor people can't afford to stay there because of the
I see.
taxes.
Right.
Even though you get all this business, you still got high taxes. And you're
So
being
they're being
forced
moved
out
back
by
to the Appalachian part.
further north, yeah. So, but there were times when, like I said, I remember even my own family was very poor. But again, we were the type that my folks, we always had food and we had a roof over our heads and we took care of the house and we paid our taxes.
Yeah.
Where a lot of people struggled to pay their taxes,
Yeah.
and lived in, well, the Wigginses were a perfect example of, their whole house you could fit into this right here,
Okay.
and they had 5 or 6 kids, 7 kids, I think.
Really?
There was Dot,